So good afternoon, everyone. Yes, my name is Anthony Leisowitz, and I'm the Director of Strategic Initiatives and the Yale Project on Climate Change here at the School of Forestry. Okay, so I'd like to begin by just saying thank you for all of you for coming today to the third lecture of our Visions of a Sustainable World lecture series. We're very, very pleased to welcome Dr. Robert Costanza, a co-founder of the field of ecological economics, to share his vision of how we all can flourish on a biophysically limited planet. Now, by way of background, this project emerged from a conference that we organized back in 2007 that tried to identify the underlying values and worldviews that are going to be required to become sustainable in the 21st century. Among its many conclusions, this group recognized that there is currently a critical lack of inspiring yet practical visions of a sustainable world and roadmaps to get us there. For decades, society has had to react to a seemingly endless series of environmental crises: oil spills, pollution, toxics, deforestation, endangered species, and now, of course, global environmental challenges. But in responding to these many threats, the environmental community has unfortunately often been much better at articulating what it is against, deforestation, climate change, etc., than in articulating what it's for. Thus, environmental research and action has often not been strategic in pursuit of a visionary goal and set of ideals. And in this context, our lecture series hopes to help catalyze concrete visions of the economies, political systems, environments, values, and lifestyles of a sustainable world that, in fact, does lie within our reach. Our first speaker was Dr. Paul Raskin, a director of the Great Transition Initiative, who presented a provocative history from the future, tracing how a sustainable planetary civilization in the year 2084 was achieved. We then hosted Alex Steffen, co-founder of worldchanging.org, who spoke about building a bright green future that works, and showcased inspiring examples of the sustainable world being constructed right now by individuals and communities around the world. Videos of the full lectures and short in-depth interviews with all of our speakers are available through the Yale YouTube channel or the project website, and I encourage you to visit environment.yale.edu/visions. I'd now like to take a moment to thank, first of all, the Geraldine R. Dodge Foundation for their support of this lecture series, and David Grant, their soon-to-be outgoing president, who's here in the audience today. Thank you, David, so much for your support. Also, thanks to the Yale Center for Business and Environment at Yale and the Yale Office of Sustainability for their support of today's lecture and their everyday efforts to make sustainability a reality right here, right now in New Haven. So it's now my pleasure to turn it over to our dean, Sir Peter Crane, who will introduce today's speaker. Thank you.
Well, by now you'll be anxious to get to the main course. It's my simple pleasure to introduce Dr. Robert Costanza, the Gordon and Luli Gund Professor of Ecological Economics and Director of the Gund Institute for Ecological Economics at the University of Vermont. Bob Costanza received his BA and MA degrees in Architecture and Environmental Engineering Sciences, all from the University of Florida. He's the author or co-author of more than 400 scientific papers and 20 books, including the landmark paper published in Nature in 1997, The Value of the World's Ecosystem Services and Natural Capital, which is one of the most highly cited, in fact, the second most highly cited article in Ecology and Environment of the last decade. That article has received a huge response. It really was an important moment in the development of the field of ecological economics, in which Bob has played an absolutely foundational role. We're very pleased and privileged to have him here today, and please join me in welcoming him to here in our school.
Good. It's a real pleasure to be here. I noticed this quirk of human psychology that the first two rows of any lecture hall are never filled up. So I'm glad that that's not any different. But otherwise, I think this is a fantastic facility that you have, thanks to Gus Speth and all of his efforts. So Flourishing on a Biophysically Limited Planet, Lessons from Ecological Economics. I want to first point out, as probably all of you now realize, that we are in a completely different time. Paul Crutzen has called our current geologic era the Anthropocene. So we're not even in the Holocene any longer. We're in an era when human impacts on the life support system are so large that we're in a completely different geologic era, a place we've never been before. I don't know if you can see this very well, but it's the nighttime satellite imagery pasted on this rotating globe. It's also true that to really solve some of the many problems that we're facing now requires that we integrate these three elements of having an adequate vision, not only of how the world works, but also of how we would like the world to be. And I'll touch on both of these elements of vision as I go through the talk. And our tools and analytical techniques have to be then appropriate to this changing vision, as do our implementation strategies, our institutions, our technologies. All of those things need to change, I think, as a unit, as a regime. So how do we make a regime shift, if you will, into this new sustainable and desirable future? I think the mainstream is even catching on to some of these ideas. This is from an editorial by Thomas Friedman recently in the New York Times, asking that, what if this recession that we're in now represents more than just another recession? What if it's really telling us that this whole growth model that we've been building over the last 50 years is just economically and ecologically unsustainable, and that we've really hit the wall? So I think our challenge is really, what do we do next? Just a little background. I'm sure many of you are aware of many of these issues. A lot of that growth in our economic system has been driven by the consumption of fossil fuels, particularly oil and gas, which is scheduled to peak, if it hasn't already, and decline in the future, probably at a faster rate even than is shown there, because of the fact that the net energy from these oil and gas liquids will decline even faster. Of course, we still have a lot of coal. Coal is not due to peak until much later, but oil runs much of our economy, and changes in oil supply certainly have dramatic effects, as do the geographic distribution of our remaining oil stocks. This shows in red the ultimate recoverable oil stocks, and in black the remaining oil stocks distributed around the planet. And you can see that all of the big black circles are really in very problematic geographic areas. At the same time, we are learning much more and quickly about how our life support system functions at multiple scales, due to the enormous efforts that we put into synthesizing much of this information. This is a global climate model run from the National Center for Atmospheric Research, showing in white relative humidity and in orange precipitation. And I think it's a compelling visual image, if nothing else, that it gives you a picture in one place of how this complex climate system that we're now impacting is functioning, and also gives us the tools to start to begin to understand how changing things like the carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere would affect the functioning of this atmospheric system. I'm sure you've all seen this diagram, the famous hockey stick diagram, showing the historical reconstructions of temperature in the northern hemisphere, the temperature increases in the historical period in red, and the projections of the various climate models, like the one I was just showing, into the future under different scenarios, all of which show increases of 2 to 6 degrees centigrade or so. You've probably also seen the Stern review on the economics of climate change. And this graph just indicates some of the impacts of changes in temperature on the various elements of the system, on food, water, ecosystems, extreme weather events, abrupt and major irreversible changes. The Stern review concluded, in summary, that keeping the temperature increases below 2 degrees centigrade, which would minimize many of the damages, would cost, and from a very conventional economic point of view, would cost on the order of 1, maybe 2% of global GDP. But not addressing those impacts and allowing them to occur would cost on the order of 5 to 20% of global GDP. So the bottom line is that prevention is certainly much less expensive than curing the problem after it's occurred, as we know from many other examples. It's also, I think, important to recognize and to bring into our consideration a much longer historical perspective. If we wish to understand sustainability, I think we need to understand how historical societies have either sustained themselves or not, or have collapsed in the past. And I think we need to build a more integrated science of the past in order to help us build this more sustainable and desirable future. All of this goes to building a better vision of how the world works, how it has worked in the past, how it does work now from this complex systems point of view, and as a basis for building a better future. One project I'm involved with is called I Hope, the Integrated History and Future of People on Earth. And the idea here is to do just that, to bring together a broad interdisciplinary group to integrate what we know about environmental history, the emerging data that we're collecting on the Earth's environment in the past, and human history. This graph tries to show that on one page. It's a log plot with starting here at 100,000 years ago, 10,000, 1,000, 100, and so on, and showing on the right technological changes, on the left various civilizations that have come and gone. I'll just point out a couple of features of this, that the red line there is the average temperature in the northern hemisphere. And you can see that during the Pleistocene, when the human species evolved, the temperature was quite erratic and going from ice ages to interglacial periods quite often. It wasn't until the beginning of the Holocene at around 10,000 years ago that the temperature stabilized at a fairly high and fairly moist level. And that our entire civilization really has been built during that period, since the beginning of the Holocene, when the climate was relatively stable. You can see that we're starting to push that temperature record off to the right a bit as we get to the recent past. I'll also point out one other thing. This is called the start of the Great Acceleration here, as it's been named. Since the end of World War II, you can see there are sort of kinks in many of these curves where things have taken off even faster than exponentially, largely as the result of the consumption of the oil and gas liquids that we were talking about before. You've probably also seen Jared Diamond's book on collapse. Again, I think the contribution of this is really to start to build this more scientific understanding of the past. How do we integrate all of the pieces that we know about what's happened? He pointed out 12 of the most serious problems that faced these historical societies, and all of these will look very familiar to you today, because I think our society is facing all of them at the same time. And our society, unlike the historical societies that have collapsed, is really a global society. If it's so interconnected that if one piece of it collapses, it's going to radically affect the rest of the system. And I think the issue is really this issue of resilience. Have we lost resilience in the system? Have we created a system that is so brittle that it's prone to collapse? We've certainly had other magnifying problems due to the increases in temperature so far, increasing frequency and intensity of storms, increasing number of flood events globally, rapidly approaching global tipping points in the climate system. This from Tim Lenton et al. Recently identifying several of the potential tipping points in the climate system where relatively small changes can lead to relatively large changes in the overall climate system. The ice sheets melting is probably the most well-known one, but there are several others that we need to take into consideration. Based on all of this, a group of us, I was one of among, I guess I haven't counted them lately, but there are, I think, somewhere around 28 co-authors on this paper, tried to identify the boundaries for a safe operating space for humanity within the biophysical limits of the planet. And we identified 9 different boundaries that are shown here in this diagram. The green circle in the middle is where we place the safe operating space. And you can see that climate change is one of those that we have already passed the boundary. We agreed with Jim Hansen that the 350 parts per million boundary represented a safe operating space. Again, we're considering that many of these variables have tipping points and rapid changes that could be occurring, and that the safe operating space was defined as being before we get to the point where those things start to change very quickly. So it's not that there's no going back, but we don't know how far we can exceed those boundaries before we run into serious problems. You can see that the other major boundaries that have been already exceeded are the biodiversity loss boundary, and exceeded by quite a bit, and the nitrogen cycle boundary. We're now putting so much more nitrogen into the system than it had historically been used to having. It's having major impacts already. Several of the other boundaries are still within the safe operating space, and a couple we really failed to quantify yet anyway. We put this out, I think, very much as a challenge to the scientific community to begin to think about where these boundaries should be, and also to think about institutionally how we could create the institutions to keep humanity within the safe operating boundaries, but also for it to flourish and be prosperous. So one question I think that comes up immediately from all of this is that in this new context that we're facing, we're not, I hope I've convinced you, not any longer in an empty world, but we're in a full world context. And what is the economy and what is it for in this context? The conventional view has been that the economy is the market, and the purpose of the economy is to maximize the rate of production and consumption in the market. But I think if we go back a little further in economic thinking, the purpose of the economy is really to sustain human well-being. And so I think we need to take that seriously and to really change our vision of the goals of the economy and of our society to one of creating and sustaining a desirable future. If you take that definition, then the economy becomes something much broader than simply the market, because the market contributes to well-being, but it certainly is not the only contributor. It's a means to an end. It is not the end in itself. There are many other factors, like the contributions of natural and social capital that are outside the market that contribute significantly to well-being and that need to be brought in if our goal really is to create the sustainable and desirable future. Just to highlight the conventional view a little bit further, the conventional view of the economy is this simple perpetual motion machine of firms and households cycling goods and services and factors of production back and forth between them. It ignores all of the contributions of natural inputs and environmental services. It ignores the sink functions of the atmosphere, for example. It ignores many of the biophysical cycles that we've just been talking about. It ignores the fact that we live on a finite planet, driven mainly by solar energy. So our vision of how the world works, I think, needs to be much more cognizant of this broader view of what the economy is and what it's for. To highlight that maybe a little bit more, this is the empty world model of the economy in a slightly different form, with the three primary factors of production: land, labor, and capital. But you can see that land is kind of grayed out here because there's the assumption of almost perfect substitutability between these factors. So if we run out of land, natural resources, forests, all of the things that you guys are studying, not a problem. We can just substitute more manufactured capital or labor, produce more goods and services measured by GDP, and then those are either consumed or reinvested to produce more capital in the next period so we can produce and consume more in the future. There's nothing in this vision of the economy that in any way limits the growth of the economy into the indefinite future. It also assumes that the more we produce and consume, the better off we are. So the basic premises are: more is always better. This economy can grow forever. Scale, then, is not a problem. The scale of the economy within the biosphere is not a problem. If it were a problem, we could solve it technologically. Poverty can best be solved with more growth. There's the idea that a rising tide lifts all boats, that nature is really a sideshow in this model. We can, maybe if we can afford, the environment, that's fine. If we can't, no big deal. And private property is always best because we're talking about rival and excludable marketed goods and services largely. Now, some people, I think, take this literally into extremes. This is an in-flight magazine ad that I found. I didn't make this up. This is not photoshopped at all. And this is from Alabama Power. Their motto is always on. So they want Alabama, that's the state of Alabama there if you didn't recognize it, from space to look like that with all the lights on all the time. Of course, others are taking a more adaptionist approach to the climate problem. And this is an actual ad from Diesel Clothing. And this is their global warming ready line of clothes. So, it's okay as long as you dress properly, the apocalypse is not a problem. I don't think that's the way we want to go. But I think we do need to change our vision of what the economy is, what it's for, what our goals are, and be more cognizant of the way the world really works. And that's this full world model of the ecological economic system, I think, tries to make some of those points, recognizing, first of all, that we do live in this materially closed Earth system, that these four types of capital, including conventional manufactured capital, but also human capital, social capital, natural capital, are not infinitely substitutable for each other. They are all required in some appropriate balance in order to run even the conventional economic production, but also they produce goods and services that affect human well-being directly without going through the market. So it recognizes that human well-being is a much more complex function than simply the more we consume, the better off we are, and the psychological evidence is rapidly building to demonstrate that. There's a whole new science of happiness, if you will, or positive psychology that recognizes that well-being is affected by material consumption only up to a fairly low threshold, and then it flattens out, and other things really contribute to well-being beyond that, including the contributions of natural and social capital. So anyway, I think the global recession that we're still in represents an opportunity to change tracks, to change our worldviews, our institutions, our technologies in a more integrated way, to get onto a track that leads to a more sustainable and desirable future. I think a key element in allowing us to do that is to create this vision of what a sustainable and desirable future would look like, a vision that's communicable enough to a broad enough audience to make the point that it is not a sacrifice to make this transition. Really, it's a sacrifice not to make the transition. But I don't think that choice has really been adequately put before the public. I don't think the public has really been adequately involved in creating that vision. So I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. But first, a couple of other points about the way the world works. The psychology of well-being, I think, is an important new scientific direction, recognizing that quality of life has at least these three elements there's a sense of subjective well-being that people feel, and there's been a lot of work surveying individuals, actually scanning their brains as well, to see when they're happy, how they feel happy, and what they feel happy about, and making the connections between that and the basic human needs that are fulfilled in order to feel that sense of well-being. And those needs transcend simple subsistence and consumption and material goods, but include many of the other things on this list. As you'll all probably recognize from a little bit of introspection, that leisure and creativity and freedom and identity and understanding and affection are all extremely important to people in terms of basic needs for having a high quality of life. And yet our economic policies largely ignore many of those things, ignore the whole issue of what really contributes to quality of life, and focus on material consumption. We can create the opportunities for people to meet their needs and to feel the sense of subjective well-being by arranging our assets more appropriately, our built, our human, and also our social and our natural capital assets, and how we use our time. So I think that's our real challenge from a policy point of view, is how do we integrate our understanding of what leads to a high quality of life with how we manage our assets. This graph, which you may have seen before in various forms, just shows the relationship between GNP per capita and life satisfaction the y-axis based on surveys of people around the world. And it shows that there is certainly a strong relationship between consumption and well-being at the lower end of the curve. But at the upper end of the curve, it pretty much flattens out. And the USA way over here is not really any happier than New Zealand or Ireland or Portugal way back here in the consumption pattern. So above around 10,000 or so dollars per capita GDP, life satisfaction doesn't really improve much with additional consumption. So what we really should be aiming for from a policy perspective, if our goal, again, is shifted away from more consumption is better and towards quality of life and spreading around that quality of life as much as we can, we should maybe be aiming for this circle here at the break point, where the overdeveloped countries could deal with a little less consumption and the underdeveloped countries need a little bit more consumption. How we measure well-being is also problematic. And a lot of our policy decisions are made these days on maximizing GDP. GDP is a very poor measure of economic well-being. In fact, it was never designed to measure economic welfare. It was only designed to measure economic activity or income, and only the marketed part of that economic income. So if there's an oil spill, somebody has to go clean it up. That leads to more activity. That's more GDP. If there's more crime, if there's more pestilence, if there's more disasters of various kinds, GDP goes up. But many of the things we count in GDP are actually costs and not benefits. We haven't really separated them well. So there have been some efforts to do just that, to separate the benefits from the costs. And this index of sustainable economic welfare, for example, or the genuine progress indicator is one. But we could take that a little further and say what we really need to be measuring is how well human needs are actually being met. And an efficient economy, the goal for the economy would be to meet those needs with as little consumption, with as little GDP as possible, rather than equating GDP with well-being. The GPI or ISEW has these elements. It starts with personal consumption expenditures, which are a major component of GDP, but then it weights those by income distribution to recognize that a dollar's worth of income to a rich person doesn't produce as much welfare as a dollar's worth of income to a poor person because of that diminishing return kind of relationship. It adds some things that are left out of GDP, the value of household labor and volunteer work, and then it subtracts a whole bunch of things that are in GDP but shouldn't be, like the costs of crime and family breakdown, and all these green elements are losses of natural capital, costs of water and air pollution and noise pollution, et cetera. Not the perfect indicator by any means of well-being, but certainly an interesting one and a better approximation, I would argue, than GDP for economic well-being. It's been applied in several different countries around the world. Here you can see some of the results here. And often the relationship turns into something like what has happened in the US, where from 1950 to about 1975, these two were highly correlated. During that period, built capital infrastructure was really the limiting factor after World War II. So GDP was what was required, increasing GDP, what was really required to improve well-being. But since then, the costs of that additional growth have begun to outweigh or at least balance out the benefits. And since then, since 1975, you could argue we've been in a recession of quality of life. So the GDP recession is, I think, not as important as the quality of life recession that we've been in for quite a while longer than that. Again, this gets back to what is our vision? What are the goals that we're pursuing? If our goals are to maximize GDP, we've been doing fine. If our goals are really to create a sustainable and desirable world, then we haven't been doing so well. And I would argue we need to switch from the former to the latter. Of course, some places have been doing better than others along these lines. This is a study that we did in Vermont showing that in the state of Vermont, Chittenden County and Burlington, GPI has continued to increase even though the US average has leveled off, largely because of, I think, the greater attention in Vermont to natural and social capital kinds of issues. You may know also that the state of Maryland has recently become the first state, the first official government entity that I know of that's going to start routinely collecting and publishing this genuine progress indicator results as a way of keeping track of something broader than GDP as their measure of progress. So I think that's a significant development. These data are also pretty consistent with surveys of life satisfaction in the U.S., which have remained fairly constant since the mid-1970s. So we've doubled GDP over this period, and yet our happiness hasn't really improved at all. So the bottom line, I think, in all of this is that growth in material consumption is not sustainable from a biophysical point of view, and it also doesn't necessarily bring happiness. It's not really desirable. So what is this new vision that we need then? And what are the elements of the new vision, and how do we actually achieve it? I would argue that we need to build this vision together as a society. I'll get a little bit more into that, but before I do, maybe I'll just point out a few of the other elements. I think one element is recognizing that the commons, as Peter Barnes has defined them here, as all the gifts that we inherit or create together, are significant contributors to our well-being. That they're not simply minor externalities, things that we can't afford to ignore, but we have to bring them very much to the forefront. And he's argued that we need a new operating system for capitalism, version 3.0, as opposed to version 2.0 before the system crashes. So our natural and social capital assets are really what we're talking about here as the commons. We've estimated, or it's been estimated, that the value of those common assets far exceeds the value of our private and state assets in the United States. So these are not minor elements, but these are, if you will, the majority of our economic well-being is coming from things that are outside the market, not inside the market. Ecosystem services certainly contribute a huge part of that. And the paper that the dean mentioned in 1997, we tried to identify these 17 different ecosystem services and quantify the degree to which they contribute to human well-being. You can see that they range from very global level things like climate regulation to more regional things like water supply, nutrient cycling, waste treatment, many of the things that we can't do without in order to survive, but that have now become limiting factors, that have now become the things that we need to economize on. We estimated their total value at $16 to $54 trillion per year altogether, significantly larger than global GDP, but almost certainly an underestimate of the value of all of these resources because of the many problems that we identified with doing this exercise. But again, recognizing that solving any of these problems, except maybe number 6, would lead to an even larger number, and I think that's been verified. The Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, which you've probably heard about, is a more recent compendium of 1,300 scientists working together to try and identify the status and trends of ecosystem services around the world, the benefits that people derive from functioning ecosystems. And I think this idea does change the whole vision and the nature of the debate around the environment. That it's not, you can't look at it as the environment versus the economy if the environment is providing a whole range of services that are extremely valuable and that are as or more valuable than our conventional economic assets. So it's really changes it to one of let's look at our assets more comprehensively. This idea has been taken up quite actively fairly recently by a number of federal and state agencies. The US EPA has now started an Office of Ecosystem Services Research. There's a study underway funded by the UN and Deutsche Bank called TEEB, the Economics of Ecosystems and Biodiversity, and several other initiatives just showing the rapid increase in the activity around this area. The state of New Jersey recently commissioned a study that we did on assessing the value of their ecosystem services and natural capital. I think several other government agencies at other levels are also becoming interested in that. It's also clear that converting our remaining natural assets to other uses has significant economic downsides if you consider the economy more broadly in the way that I'm talking about. This is from the Millennium Assessment, again showing the loss of value in converting intact wetlands to intensive farming, sustainable forestry into small-scale farming, etc. If one considers the total value of all of the ecosystem services on the top end. We did a study recently to try to assess, the benefit-cost ratio of preserving our global natural capital assets. And we started with a scenario of increasing the global reserve network to 15% of the terrestrial biosphere, 30% of the marine biosphere. That would cost, we estimated, around $45 billion per year. But the benefits, the net difference between the intact system and the converted system, would be on the order of $4 to $5 trillion a year. So a benefit-cost ratio of 100 to 1. Quite a good investment these days. The only better investment I could find was for oil companies investing in political campaigns. Unfortunately, hopefully that's changed. So now I want to move on more to the topic, I think, of this talk, of the importance of envisioning and what a future vision of our nation, of our cities, of our entire world would look like, and how do we create that vision, and how do we communicate it. This is from a paper that Dana Meadows published in 1996 on principles for effective envisioning. And I think that is our challenge these days, our most important challenge. How do we create a shared vision and implement it? So her principles are these 5, that we have to focus on what we really want and not what we'll settle for. And you can see on the left, there's a list of things we really want. We want human happiness. We want permanent prosperity. We don't really want GDP or unsustainable growth, which is what we've been getting. The vision should be judged by the clarity of its goals, not the clarity of its implementation path. So often we get stuck by saying, well, this could never happen, so therefore we won't put it on the table. You have to put that aside and say, what is it that we really want? And then the path will reveal itself. Number 3 is that responsible vision must acknowledge but not get crushed by the physical and political constraints of the real world. Another version of the same thing. We can't let the seeming impossibility of these things get in the way of putting forth the vision, because the vision can be extremely empowering and can allow people to do things that they would never have thought they could do before. Number 4, it's critical for the visions to be shared. I think this is one that we often ignore. And how do we do that? I think that should be really the essence of a democratic society, is this process of creating a shared vision as an ongoing process. It's not something that we do in 1776, among a relatively small group and write it down and then that's the end of it. That's something that we need to do every day, is to continually talk about, discuss, share, and create this vision of what a sustainable and desirable future would be. So I think that's a big part of our challenge on the political side. How do we create the institutions to allow us to really do that? And the 5th point, I think, goes to what I was just saying. The vision has to be flexible and evolving. So it's more of a process than a product. You heard already about the Great Transition Initiative from Paul Raskin as one attempt to do that. Another exercise that I was involved with is talked about here at this website. We got a group of about 40 people together and asked them the question, what would the United States look like in the year 2100 in your perfect vision? I think one of the interesting things about these exercises is that you get much more consensus than you might expect from a fairly diverse group of people if you ask the question in that way. What is your vision for the future? There's quite a bit of overlap there, and we can utilize that characteristic to build this shared vision and then use it to work backwards. We also recently did a study of the University of Vermont at the academic scale. What would the university look like in people's preferred visions? You can take a look at that at this website. The ESDA project ended up with several elements, I think, of this shared vision. And we broke it into these 5 categories of worldview, natural capital, built capital, human capital, and social capital. And very much the things that I've been talking about were elements of that vision, that we have to change our worldview to consider humans as part of nature, as part of the system, to have a more steady state ecological economy, to have the goal be quality of life rather than merely consumption, that our natural capital needs to be protected as essential life support. Our built capital needs to be shifted to run on renewable energy, et cetera. Many of the things I think that that probably Paul already talked about in his vision of the future. So there is, I think, an underlying consensus that's there that we need to really build out, flesh out, and communicate, and get more people involved in. One of the ways to do this that I think has been quite effective is this process of scenario planning based on these four assumptions that I think are pretty incontrovertible, that the future is probably going to be unlike the past and shaped by our choices and actions, that we can't foresee the future, but we can explore possible futures to inform present decisions. And there are many possible futures out there. And so what we really can do is map the possibility space and use that as a way for people to help make decisions about what their preferred future is. So I think this can be very effective in this process of creating some consensus around the preferred shared vision, which involves both rational analysis and creative thinking, I think in a very synergistic way. I just put together here a table of some of the recent scenario exercises that have gone on. And it was interesting to me that they fell out in terms of this range of quality of life of the various scenarios that they projected. And as you probably know, many of these exercises end up with 4 future scenarios, usually on 2 different axes. I'm not sure if that's the best way to do it, but it does provide some comparability even between the different studies. One of the most famous ones that sort of got all of this going was the Montfleur exercise in South Africa, where at the post-apartheid era, they created these 4 scenarios for what could happen after the change in government. And you can see the least desirable one, the ostrich scenario. Everybody sticks their head in the sand. The lame duck scenario was the white government stays there, but it becomes a lame duck. The Icarus scenario is a black government takes over and tries to change things too quickly. And the flight of the flamingos was where they did the truth and reconciliation approach and tried to work together in a more consistent way. And this scenario exercise, I think, had a big influence on what actually happened there. They did actually take the flight of the flamingos scenario seriously and try to pursue that. Several others of these scenarios, so you've heard about the Great Transition scenarios already. The Millennium Ecosystem Assessment you probably heard about, also used this scenario planning exercise to talk about what might happen to ecosystem services in the future. I did one myself back in 1999, looking at different possibilities for the future. And I'll talk about a few others that I've been involved with recently, just to give you some flavor for how some of these things go at the national level, at the global level, and at the regional level for Iowa and for the Great Barrier Reef. So this exercise I talked about tried to array different worldviews and policies where the conventional worldview of technological optimism, that technology will solve all of our problems, versus technological skepticism, that maybe it won't and maybe it might cause additional problems that we hadn't foreseen, versus the real state of the world. Are the optimists right? Are the skeptics right? And if the optimists are right, we end up in the Star Trek future. If the skeptics are right, we end up in the Mad Max future. And on the other hand, if we have a skeptical worldview and policies and the optimists turn out to be right, we end up in the big government scenario versus the ecotopia scenario. I then surveyed people to ask them what their comfort level was. If they found themselves in any of these scenarios, how desirable would they have found it? And this is a plot of the results. Again, showing that sort of range of qualities for the different scenarios. The ecotopia scenario was much preferred. There were 2 intermediate scenarios, and there was one that was really, we don't want to go there. And I think this is often the case in these sort of scenario planning exercises, that there's a least desirable scenario which we want to stay away from. So from a policy point of view, and from a sort of simple game theory point of view, we want to take the position, the policies that lead to the best worst case, and that would certainly be a more skeptical point of view in this analysis. because if we don't, we might end up here, but we might end up in a very bad place. So we want to protect ourselves. We would take the lower risk scenario. This is I'll just quickly run through a couple of other examples. This is one that we recently did in Iowa on the future of agriculture in the U.S. And this was done as a problem-based course with students from Iowa State and from the University of Vermont and professors from both places and a range of stakeholders that we visited on the ground around the state of Iowa. The axes that we used here were some of the major uncertainties involved, whether energy was going to remain cheap or become expensive, and on the other axis, whether society was going to retain the current worldview of maximizing GDP and market focus versus taking a broader GPI type of focus. And these are the 4 scenarios that come out. We also managed to produce maps and visualizations of each of those scenarios. And so the idea is to take this sort of information out to a much broader public and show them, here are the possibilities for the future of agriculture. It was quite amazing that all of the people we interviewed along the way, ranging from very conventional farmers to organic farmers, none of them really wanted to see what was happening continue to happen. They all, unanimously almost, wanted to see a return to smaller scale farms and farm communities and certainly more organic production. They just were unable to go against the forces that were arrayed there. So by putting the vision out there and getting some broad consensus, I think we could move things in the right direction. Another example that I've been involved with is this one on the Great Barrier Reef, Catchment and Reef Ecosystem Services, looking at what might happen if climate disruption is severe, if the world stays focused on the growth path that it's on, versus climate disruption is a little bit milder if we do get the climate situation under control. The impacts on the reef are both from what's happening at the global scale, affecting global seawater temperature and acidity, but also what's happening at the local scale, what's happening with runoff from the land. And so that's the other axis, what happens if locally a more quality of life focus versus an economic growth focus stays in play. And we managed to utilize some existing models of these different scenarios to produce ideas about what would happen to the coral reef under those various scenarios. Under the trashing the common scenario, the coral reef disappears. Under the other scenarios, some amount of coral reef is preserved out to the year 2100. And we also managed to map those different scenarios. Again, I think this will be a very effective tool to help communicate with the stakeholders involved what the real possibilities are for the future and to generate some consensus about the preferred alternative and then generate ways of getting there. One other example I'll point to is this in New Zealand. They did an envisioning exercise or a scenario planning exercise somewhat similarly. They then, and the sort of independent Aturia scenario was the one that was obviously the highest quality of life. They asked then the participants after the fact, where did they think that New Zealand was in the current period? And they thought they were generally over here. They asked them where they thought they were going, and they thought they were getting even worse, going in this direction. And they asked them where they would really want to go. And they had this preferred scenario. So this is a way of getting at, among that range of scenarios, building some consensus about where we really want to go. Okay. Am I almost out of time? I am out of time. I think I'll end with this one, which is just a summary of what the current model is, sometimes called the Washington Consensus, and this more sustainable and desirable development model or future for the system. And the transition that we need to make, I think, is from this middle column's vision to the right column's vision. That we need to shift our primary goal from more economic growth, from getting bigger to better, to more of a development paradigm, one that focuses on quality rather than quantity. We need to have better measures of how to do that, shifting from GDP to GPI, for example. We need to make scale or carrying capacity a primary concern because real biophysical limits do exist. We cannot continue to ignore them. We need to make distribution and poverty issues a primary concern because they affect social capital, they affect quality of life very directly. There's mounting evidence that that's a real issue, and the conventional model really doesn't give adequate weight to those considerations. A rising tide doesn't lift all boats, it turns out. It only lifts all yachts. So economic efficiency and allocation is also a primary concern in both places, but we need to bring in all of the social and natural capital assets that are outside the market. Otherwise, our conventional allocation mechanism is highly inefficient. The externalities now have become so large that the current system is giving us very bad information about what the real costs of things are. We need to change our property rights ideas to allow more emphasis on common property resources as well as private and state property resources. Eleanor Ostrom won the Nobel Prize this last time for her work on common property systems. And there are whole regimes of common property institutions I think we need to better develop in order to help us get there. We need to recognize that government has a central role to play. It's not to be minimized and replaced with private and market institutions, largely because these institutions only really deal well with private goods, with goods that are rival and excludable. And many of the things that are now recognizably much more important for our continued well-being are outside of that. They're not rival, they're not excludable goods, they're public goods. And government needs to take a central role in managing those goods and developing new institutions to do that. We need to move away from laissez-faire market capitalism to a new set of principles for sustainable governance. The climate skeptics have been getting a lot of play recently, and I'm sure you can read this, but what if it's a big hoax and we create this better world for nothing? So I think our goal really is to just put forward the better world, to create that vision and communicate that vision to a much broader audience. I think that's really been our challenge, or the remaining challenge. I think there are lots of people working on creating the vision. I think that vision is probably broadly shared, but it hasn't been really broadly shared yet. We haven't gotten it out to the general public. I don't think the general public recognizes that there is any other way than the direction that we're going in right now. So how do we do that? We need to convert not only our built capital, but also our human, our social, and our natural capital assets in various ways. And we need to transform our culture. We need to transform our worldviews. And just to give you a little bit of hope that maybe this may be happening already, this is from the work of Paul Ray and Sherry Anderson on what they call the cultural creatives. They are a market research firm, and they've been surveying people since the 60s and categorizing them into these, according to their worldviews, their broad worldviews, into these three categories of cultural creatives, modernists, and traditionalists. And this text here describes what a cultural creative is, but it's, I think, largely the worldview that we've been talking about. What's interesting is that the percentage of cultural creatives in the society has been rapidly increasing over time, and that the tipping point culturally may be on the horizon, sooner than we think, when this group really gets to a critical mass and can make the transition to the sustainable and desirable society. So the long-term solution is break our addiction to this growth at all costs economic paradigm and vision and model to fossil fuels to overconsumption, to envision this more sustainable and desirable future with focusing on quality of life. It's going to require that we change almost everything about our civilization, but it's not a sacrifice to do that. It's really a sacrifice not to do that. And to help in that process, we're starting a new journal/website called Solutions that's intended to be a very transdisciplinary hybrid academic journal and popular magazine as a place where we can have this ongoing discussion about what the real solutions might be, what what does our vision of the future really consist of? And I think it has several unique elements. Ida Kubashevsky here is the managing editor of Solution. She's going to pass around a couple copies of the first issue, and hopefully we'll get those back from you. And I would encourage you all to subscribe, but also contribute to this ongoing dialogue in various ways. I know that people in this room are doing many things that represent pieces of the solution. What we really want is to create the venue for having this ongoing discussion. The internet, I think, is producing some real changes in what is possible, anyway, in terms of having this discussion. We can feasibly, I think, have a global dialogue about our shared future. And I think that's the opportunity that we need to take if we are to avoid the hurricane here and turn the ship, even though it's very difficult to turn, towards a more sustainable and desirable future. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Bob. That was a wonderful talk. I think we have a few minutes for questions, and this lecture, as well as a shorter in-depth interview, will also be made available, again, through Yale YouTube, as well as through the project website. So yes, we're trying to disseminate and make these materials as open access as possible. Over here.
Most of the solutions you've described, it seems like, require positive incentives or require a positive response, but people don't always respond to that. So what about negative measures, taxation and inhibition of expensive problems?
I don't have a problem with that, but I think in order to get those sorts of policies implemented requires that there be a positive vision on the other side of what you're going to achieve by imposing those. And I think that's often the missing element, that people say, no, the tax is just going to hurt me, without looking at the positive implications. You know, a carbon tax is the perfect example. I mean, it will help us achieve these goals, but if you don't really get people to buy into the goals, it's hard to get them to buy into the tax.
Okay, more questions?
I'm Marian Chertow, professor in our industrial ecology group, and as I think about the basic facts, you know, they're ones that we are very sympathetic with in this school, and yet I feel like the audience out there in our country is shrinking. You know, Tony does these impressive studies about how support for an understanding of global warming is declining. You know the daily news where militias are tripling and so forth. You spoke about the need to expand the audience, that this is clearly a vision that many people are sympathetic with because you showed many studies where, you know, results were somewhat similar, but there are so many people in our country who seem to be moving away from this kind of a perspective, and how do we reach out?
Well, I think the first step might be to return to a democracy in our country rather than a corporatocracy. And I think that's what's been limiting the real discussion of many of these issues, that, you know, that special interests are now controlling, you know, the media, as well as you know, influencing many of the things on the ground. So I don't know how to overcome that, but I think maybe Paul Raskin mentioned that we do need a movement of some kind. You know, we need to coalesce. You've probably seen Paul Hawkins' book on blessed unrest, that there are a huge number of organizations out there, you know, millions literally, that are working in this area, but they're very uncoordinated. And so if we could coordinate all of that activity and get it all moving in the same direction, and I think also get past the media bottleneck, you know, by using other media like the internet to you know, to get past the Fox News kind of you know, distortions of what's going on. So I think I think there might be a tipping point approaching, though, where you know, that critical mass really gets there. And I think many of the people that are angry are angry at the wrong people for the wrong reasons, and don't really understand, how it's not really benefiting their own self-interest or their own well-being. And if you propose a society with more jobs, with more fulfilling jobs, with more leisure time, with a higher quality of life, I think that's what people really do want. They just don't see the connection between where we are now and the policies we're pursuing now and that kind of future.
I think a lot of the conflict comes from the confusion of ends versus means, in that, the argument seems to be between capitalists and collectivists, but really both are just tools to get to an end, and more of us agree on the ends than agree on the means.
Right.
So I think, what are the ways that we can agree on the means and avoid arguing, agree on the ends and avoid arguing about the means?
Well, I think that's exactly right, and I think that's the idea behind creating this shared vision, of really discussing the goals, which we're not really discussing at all. We are only arguing about the means, and certainly the means that are put before people are means to a different end. They're both means to the end of unlimited economic growth. So that's the change in vision, I think, that we need to really start discussing, and moving more towards a more shared quality of life kind of vision. Neither of our neither conventional capitalism or conventional socialism, I think, do a very good job of getting us to that goal. So I think we'll need new institutions as well that will be different from the ones that we have now. Not that we'll throw out the market, but we'll use the market as a servant rather than as a master. We won't share everything equally. We'll have room for private property, but we'll also have room for community property and for state property in the appropriate kind of balance. So creating those new institutions, I think, is going to be the challenge. But I think we'll only even get to first base with that creation if we can create a shared vision of what the goals are.
Hi, I'm Don Worcester, an historian. I'm having a little bit of trouble figuring out what ecological economics is at its core and how it fits into what you just described as conventional capitalism, conventional socialism. Because much of what you talked about seems to me to be very strongly a movement away from conventional capitalism, but in the direction, I suppose, of socialism of some sort. But you also talk about Lovin's and Hawkins' view of the world, and I'm thinking particularly their book, Natural Capitalism, which suggests that we can have capitalism that has an ecological awareness and everything will be fine. So how do you position yourself on that issue, and particularly the Lovin's-Hawkins book?
Well, I don't think the old categories really work anymore. So I think we need to come up with a different definition of what we're aiming for. And like I said, I think the market has a role to play in that spectrum of things, because it deals very well with private goods. But the problem is that private goods are only a small part of the real system. And how do we develop institutions that deal with the rest? But in the context. So it's not like we can shift completely to dealing with everything as a common good or everything as a private good, but there's a balance in between. So it's a little of both. And I've been actually looking for a word for that for a while. So what is this sustainable quality of life economy? One word that I've come up with is a Swedish word, lagom, which means that there's enough to go around, and it's shared relatively equally, but it's not sort of a minimalist kind of thing. So it really embodies several of the elements. Ecological economics really thinks about sustainable scale, so you can't be too big to impact your life support system. Fair distribution, how do you share things equitably or fairly, not necessarily equally, and efficient allocation. How do you make sure you use things efficiently? So that's kind of the essence of ecological economics, and it's not really well embodied in any of our existing paradigms, but we need to create something, I think, something new. for the third millennium. We need, something that's going to also last.
And with that, I think Bob will be here for at least a few more minutes to talk informally if you'd like. So if you'll please join me in thanking Bob Costanza for sharing.